Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
If you get the right culture at a station, they are fantastic. They will provide 100% availability. They will have fun. They will also be really good at helping people on the worst day of their life. That's ultimately what people want to do. They want to help others. They want to perform a role that's bigger than them.
These large fire engines, they represent a cultural investment. It's a nominal extra cost of those few extra firefighters attending an incident. Yet culturally, it's massive. And so they engender retention. And in part, that's simply because they reduce despondency. There's kind of nothing worse than your alert going off at 2 o'clock in the morning, driving to the fire station, and then you being the person that is number 7.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
It's my first podcast, so I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm here to kind of join in.
I'm about 250 deep and I've still not quite learned the I don't think there is any nuances to it, to be honest with you. I think that's the beauty of it. It's such an early culture. It's such an early sector, to be honest, that there are no rules, you know what I mean? All that sort of rubbish. Steve, how are you doing, dude?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me on. And I totally agree. It's like almost like the start of a new genre in a way, isn't it, the podcast? It's a bit like when The Sopranos turned up on the box set thing. It's like, oh, this is interesting, this is good. And then fast forward 10 years and it's just all everybody watches is a boxed set that gets binged on. And I think
it's going to be one of those things, mate. It's the kind of the old 10-year overnight success. Dan, you are new. This is the first time I've been able to jump a conversation. We first met each other, I believe, at the awards down in London in December. But you've done a whole host of work in and around the NFCC, the work that you do professionally with Shropshire Fire and Rescue Service. Give us a little bit of a background around how you sort of got started in the sector, joined the fire service, and the work you've done up until now.
Okay, there's a lot. So if I start to bore at you, please chip in.
It gives me a break.
I started in 2000. Yeah, it gives you a break. I started in 2000, Hereford and Worcester. Was due to go and do biochemistry at Birmingham, but it felt like it wasn't right for me. And just kind of went down to Kidderminster Fire Station and thought, well, this could be a fantastic career and really suit me. And we'll probably come back to it. But last year I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I think that has really helped in me frame why it's been such a good career for me. So spent 16 years in Hereford and Worcester. Then was promoted into Nottinghamshire as area manager in charge of service delivery. Then was promoted again into assistant chief officer in Lincolnshire. Then COVID hit, so I was seconded into Lincolnshire County Council to support the COVID piece as an assistant director, and then was really pleased and successful to kind of come home to the West Midlands and Shropshire about 2 years ago in January as the assistant chief, as it was then, responsible for service delivery, and really kind of thrilled to kind of be leading and supporting lead part of the executive team of Shropshire Fire and Rescue Service, who are doing some really fantastic and innovative stuff. And then along the way, kind of picked up, as you do, you get more strategic and senior in the organisation and start to try and give something back to the sector. And that for me was through the National Fire Chiefs Council. I'm the project executive for the economic and social value of UK FRS. Another fascinating piece of work. Yeah, ESV is how I call it. And people are starting to give me a reputation that I will only work with doctors, Dr. Ian Greatbatch, and of course Steve. But it's not true. But they, I am really. It
helps if they know what they're talking about, doesn't it? And that's why I don't diminish. Like, and I wouldn't necessarily say Steve is always there. I certainly am not. But what I mean is, it's what we said with the previous conversation with Steve. It's like we can all have a lot of passion and a lot of our own personal biases, but actually, when you're working with somebody from an academic background, there can be a great calibration.
And I think for me, there was a couple of things. So I got a phone call from the previous chief of West Midlands, Phil Lope. She says, I've got a development opportunity for you. And I think a lot of your listeners will understand what that means.
Yeah. I love those ones.
And I never thought we'd, speaking candidly, I never thought we'd get anywhere near the methodology that we've created. Working with Dr. Michael and Dr. Florian from Nottingham Trent University, we've been able to demonstrate that the fire service adds real economic and social value. Now, we all knew it, but we couldn't prove it. And I've been knocking around for a few years, and the conversation has been, fire service, you add value there, but prove it. And now we can. So I think it's really kind of innovative and cutting edge and fledgling research, but I'm really excited about how we can demonstrate that the fire service adds value, whether it's the communities of Shropshire or elsewhere in kind of more urban areas and the Mets through to kind of the big services like Scotland and LFB. I'm really excited about how services can use it.
What I didn't want to jump past there was you got a diagnosis of dyslexia last year. How old are you?
I'm 42.
Why did you choose to venture down that rabbit hole and have that? Because I know a lot of people getting sort of diagnosis for things. I had one personally myself last year, and it kind of gave me a greater level of understanding. I didn't want to skip past that because that's quite crucial for some people.
And thank you for not skipping past it. I guess we'll come back to it. Where was I? So I was a training instructor. I was a lead BAI, kind of supported course skills, and I had an inkling. That something wasn't quite right, and almost did a very kind of surface kind of review of dyslexia, and they kind of said there might be something there, but you've worked out so many workarounds that just crack on.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we kind of just limp our way through, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mine was around ADHD, and I didn't know why I struggled so much with. I mean, I'm a recovered addict, so I think that's probably would have been a lean into it when I was younger as well. But also now I have this hyperactivity thing, and I struggle to sit still, and I struggle. And I thought it was like an empathy exhaustion from the emergency services, where I struggled with like mediocrity, or I struggled in social environments where I felt I'm no better or worse than anybody, but I felt like it's just things didn't really interest me very much that seemed to interest a lot of other people, and it made me feel really bad. So it was a real sort of game changer for me.
Yeah, and it was for me. And I landed at Shropshire, and Shropshire have got a really good kind of approach to dyslexia and neurodiversity. And I was kind of like thinking, well, I've landed as the new ACFO for service delivery. I really should put my money where my mouth is and front up and do it. And it was fascinating, Pete. 6-hour assessment for my dyslexia. And it was great because at one point I was doing too well. And she put her hand over her mouth. And I went from scoring full marks to 0 in the click of a hand over the mouth. And I said, what's that about? And she goes, you lip read. And I was like, really? Wow. So I was she was saying the word and making the shape with her mouth, and I was looking and repeating. And then as soon as she covered her mouth, that was it. I couldn't pronounce any of the words she just said. So
tell you what, you've got to be good at your job to know that sort of stuff, haven't you? This is what I'm saying.
It was
People that help in those sort of, and that's the massive game. You said like you worked in the training department for a little bit. We're trying to do more of that in the training department that I work for, to recognize and support in support structures for people that have those learning challenges, because they can just be invisible. Up until your 40s, 50s, 60s, you could go your whole life and not realize why there's such a disconnect with certain things. Talk to me about the work within FCC. Just, we went into a lovely little abbreviation around ECV. What the heck is that? And you said about working with people around understanding the real economic value that the fire service had. If you could take us down that rabbit hole just to understand that a little bit of work more.
Yeah, it's a podcast in itself, I think, Pete.
Okay.
So back in, I think, let me just check. Back in 98, I think it was. No, that's not right. 2018. Took 20 years off. Took 20 years off. That's the dyslexia kicking in. And what we did is kind of in the initial kind of creation of the NFCC, they worked very closely with Nottingham Trent University and Rowena Hill to conduct a gap analysis. So what weren't we doing? And that resulted in kind of a key pillar back in the day of NFCC Community Risk Programme. And that was led by Phil Loach. And Phil often talked about it being a toolkit, the Community Risk Programme being a toolkit, and there's lots of tools in there, from the new CRMP guidance, the definition of risk, evaluations, competencies. But one of those tools was the economic and social value of the fire and rescue service. And I kind of mentioned it earlier. It was very much about, for me, the driver was I'd kind of spent years knowing that, and in my gut, in my heart, knowing that the fire service added real value, but we couldn't prove it. And this was the first chance that NTU said, well, I think we can. I think we can produce something. And in essence, we worked with Nottingham Trent University, and I said Dr. Michael and Dr. Florian and Dr. Ian Greatbatch. Ian was I think he's been on-call firefighter, but he was a leading firefighter in LFB with a kind of research background. And we seconded him to the project. Again, a really intelligent, clever person who could cut through the kind of academic, but also cut through the fire service kind of approach to all of this and blend it all together. So between the three of them, they produced a fantastic report, which was published and went live in September. We're also hoping to get the Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh data added to it now. But it's fantastic. It's a kind of number of methodologies that allow us to place a social and economic value on fire incidents, non-fire incidents, and prevention and protection activities. And I often talk about it's about the methodology. It's about helping fire and rescue services understand where they get the biggest bang for their buck. Where should they be putting and investing their money? But it also reflects what great value the fire and rescue service creates. And if anyone wants to look at it, go to the NFCC portal for economic and social value, and you'll see that we've been able to demonstrate that for the 3 years that the report and the research covered, which was 2016-17 to 2018-19, that the fire service can demonstrate that we've added over £11 billion worth of value to the communities and the society that we serve.
And there's got to be loads more of that still left in the bucket, because now we understand the metrics even better. We can start, I would uneducatedly assume, that we can start to steer our strategies towards that, rather than just stabbing in the dark and accidentally fumbling into some economical benefits.
And you're absolutely right, Pete. Without getting too techie, we've only used the third standard deviation of the data. So if you were to look at flooding as an example of what we've been able to create, what we've been able to identify, that for the period, the 3-year period that we did the research, that rescues from water and flooding is effectively over £1 billion per year in terms of value. Wow. But we've only used incidents, so the top 1% of incidents where effectively has been attended by over 16 firefighters and been there for over 200 minutes. Now, there was a rescue from the River Severn just before Christmas where crews from Shrewsbury went out in the water within 5, rescue, without doubt saved that life, not even included. So we didn't want to overcook it. We didn't want to kind of introduce it to the sector, introduce it to central government, and then be kind of left with egg on our face. So we've been really conservative with our estimates. So with further research and better data, I think we can demonstrate that the fire service adds even more value.
Well, stand by for some inbound pestering from me, because that is most definitely something I'd like to go further into. How did you first meet Steve? Because I'd love to go into some of the detail that you won an award last year together, because you've done some incredible work in this area. But I want to know again, how did this serendipitous relationship kind of come to fruition and sort of start giving birth to all these benefits that both Shropshire and hopefully the wider services can learn a little bit from?
Yeah, thank you. So, Steve, shall I tell my story?
Yeah, please do. And Pete, just to be clear, because we need to be very clear, definitely I didn't win an award, Dan didn't win an award, Shropshire won an award. I was shortlisted. And Dan was part of the Evo team that was also shortlisted, and we were more than happy to be there and to celebrate Shropshire, really. But just wanted to make that
with that awkwardness out of the way, we'll push on.
Come on the podcast and make bold claims.
That's all I do, mate. That's all I do. Just bold claims that are unfounded.
Yeah, it does sound better than the very measured approach of, oh no.
Yeah.
Dan, take us.
Yeah, so it was really random, Pete. Someone emailing me saying, I'm really interested in the economics and social value work you're doing. And I was like, where's this come from? So it was weird. So this bloke called Steve emails me saying, I'd really like to get involved. And no one does that except for probably Ian and the team from the NFCC, which is Pukita and Paul Cohen. No one talks to me about it. So it was really odd to kind of get this email saying, please, I'm really interested in it. So it came from a on-call fire station in the depths of Shropshire from Hodnet Fire Station. So I rock up to Hodnet and we sit down and have a cup of tea, and I've got an on-call firefighter who then announces to me I'm a Post-Doctoral Research Fellow at Keele University and I'd love to do something. And it wasn't the ESV kind of piece of work, but we just started talking, and I think it really does show you how, and Steve often talks about this, is the kind of power of two becoming the kind of power of three, when you are kind of just bouncing off each other and sparking in terms of the ideas. And it was absolutely clear that straight away we were kind of from a similar position and understanding. And it was, what can we do together? How can we make this work? And it was kind of post HMI before our kind of good report came out. And I was still kind of struggling about how Shropshire were doing so well. And, the challenge is, okay, we've got the leading availability for England. How have we done it? And, talking to Steve, it became very clear very quickly that this is something that we could work on together in terms of academic research, for once being able to say with some assurance that these are the reasons, or at least why we think were the reasons.
How many of those untapped resources do you think are out there? Because that really is a gift. And with so many new people joining the emergency services at different age ranges, they've got some really impressive, colossal backgrounds from private sector and stuff like that can really add some value in these things.
Yeah, and I think for me, that's the challenge for fire and rescue services, to really tap into that talent pool of staff that they've got on their doorstep, whether that's a plumber and a sparkier and a plasterer who can make those quick and effective changes to stations. I'm not talking about refurbs, but just putting little things right, through to postdoctorate research fellows who help frame the kind of research and the thoughts that we have, and some of the challenges I've had from equality and diversity and understanding our recruitment pool, through to why is Shropshire successful and trying to prevent what I think is a really challenging environment and how we maintain that availability.
So Steve, when you first reached out to Dan, did you have the perception that it would be someone that was willing for advice? Because actually, with the greatest respect to some people in senior leadership positions, advice can be forthcoming, but doesn't always accept it and open-minded to things like that, because you're brand new to the service. Did you anticipate someone would arrive on your station from a senior leadership team and be so open to your involvement?
No, I didn't really think I had many preconceived ideas about it, really. I didn't really know Dan, and he was immediately interested when I sent this big, long diatribe email about the economic and social value, which, to give you some background on that, the reason why I was so interested is because my PhD was in looking in part at value. And so I understood to some extent the different methodologies and the complexities of just the term, just defining the term. And so that was why I sort of geeked out with Dan and got in touch. But
I love what you say there about defining it. Sorry to interrupt, because when we always used to talk about problem solving in private corporation I used to work for, it's always about asking better questions, isn't it? It's about defining what is the problem, what is the solution, what is the definition of success. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the modus operandi of most research, isn't it? You get a primary research question, and then behind that you get another set of questions. But that's the most important thing, really, is identifying that question that gets the answer that helps you solve the problem. And it's sometimes the hardest thing to do, actually, is just to define the question and ask the right question. You're right, Pete. So yeah, I didn't really know what was going to come, but I'm a year on in, I'm very pleased it's worked out as it did, really, because as we talked about before on a podcast, Pete, and I know Christian from Sheffield University touched on when he was on your podcast, that culture of collaboration within the fire and rescue service is really important. So whatever I thought was going to follow between Dan and I knew that the innovations were going to come through the collaboration. As Dan said, really, I definitely believe in this idea that you need that two at least to chime, to riff off, to make three, two minds make three. And yeah, that's when you come up with your best ideas and have your best conversations and start to actually unpick problems like you couldn't otherwise do when you're just in the inner monologue of your mind or staring at a blank piece of paper. So I think they were the two. Then when we started to sort of work out how it might work and how it might work for Shropshire, Dan and I also were very keen to make sure we were celebrating Shropshire's success, not in a self-aggrandizing way, not to go out to the rest of the world and say, this is how you should do it, but actually to just go that within Shropshire, part of valuing the current workforce and valuing its, recognizing its success is to find out what it's doing well and to continue to do that well, really. And that's why we came up with these ideas of existing good practices. And that's what we tried to identify. What are the existing good practices that seem to be taking place in Shropshire that to some extent you can benchmark against other reports from the sector, from others' HMI reports, from what wider research says about what might be a good idea to do. And so that we went into it with this real positive mindset. And as Dan's very keen to say, and me too, really, that doesn't mean that what we created with the research project was some sort of generic blueprint for every service in this country and around the world to apply to their service in order to improve its on-call availability. Actually, what we found was that there's a lot of Shropshireisms, there's a lot of things that are specific to Shropshire, and that Shropshire can do well, but some of that will serve, we hope, the rest of the sector.
Because, the only problem with doing something really well, Dan, is the fact that the only way to go from there is ultimately down. So when we talk about sustaining that success or trying to slow down the trend of that downward trend that certain services are experiencing, you guys commissioned this whole sort of sustaining success piece. What was the initial thought processes when you were going into that, and sort of alluding to what Steve's just gone into there, talking about the broad base of evidence that you needed to gather and start to, similar, I suppose, to your other piece of work, what would that look like?
Yeah, and I think it started off as for me, a number of questions. I was kind of thinking to myself, well, I've been in 4 fire and rescue services, which provides a challenge in itself for the sector, I think, as well as myself. But why was Shropshire's availability over 90%? But that experience of other fire and rescue services and that national piece, understanding that once the slide starts, it's really hard to get it back. And I think that was the kind of driver for me of having experience of subs of on-call stations with less than 40% availability. Once it slips, and once you get on-call firefighters not buying into keeping that appliance on the run, then you know, using the sporting analogy, you kind of find it hard. You've lost the dressing room. How do you get it back?
Well, by the time you see the evidence, it's usually started long before that. It's a little bit like when somebody leaves a job, they actually left 6 months ago. You're just starting to see the outcome of it. Do you know what I mean? By the time you get the evidence, the slide's already started, isn't it?
And that's really kind of intuitive, Pete, because when we started this, our on-call availability was in the high 90s. You know, as we came out of the on-call, as we came out of the pandemic, people were at home, and we still had high availability. Now, as individuals and families and friends and as life gets back to whatever our new normal is, it's proving more and more difficult, and we've started to see that slide. So it was having that kind of foresight to know that actually it's a really, unless you know why you're successful, and there are some fantastic successes, you know, Steve's been able to identify the extra large cabs where we can take 9 firefighters to an incident. It's really unique to Shropshire, but it was kind of implemented back in 2005-06 when we carried out our RDS review. That it's those things that put us in a good place. But now was the time to carry out a further review, talking to our people, letting them tell us what the issues are and also the solutions, and then wrapping around the evidence and data and research to give a really strong and robust argument for me to then use that as a foundation, a launch pad to implement what I hope is just about maintaining that high level of availability. I don't think anything over 90% for me will be success, because it is a challenging landscape that we find ourselves.
Massively challenged, and so much for everybody else as well. I mean, take us in then, Steve, to some of those things that came out of it, because I know there was a 37 or something existing good practices you recognized, but then you came up with some recommendations as well.
Ultimately all the research kind of fed into the business recommendations that Dan decided upon, really, and the senior management team to be presented for agreement, and will get rolled out as the project proceeds. But to just go back a minute to the question you asked before, really, about, how did we come to the conclusions we did, and how did the research take place? Why did it work? In part because it came off the back of a preceding engagement survey that Shropshire was already doing. So the entire project started prior to me being involved, about 2 years prior. And a watch manager in Shropshire, hope you won't mind me saying his name, I don't think you will, Steve Perks, great guy, really good looking at the data, and really got out into the workforce. And for 2 years, he did a utterly comprehensive engagement survey where it included focus group meetings. He went to the stations individually more than once. He did a massive survey itself. And so when I came in to support that, he already had this bank of not only workforce engagement data, but he'd been data mining within the service for about 2 years. So he'd already pulled out loads of good stuff on skills, on historical availability, on, recruitment levels and training capacities. And so it made my life really easy then when I came in to support the overall project, and to lend that objectivity that comes from looking at wider research and evidence. I was able to go, okay, well, the wider evidence suggests this, and the staff have said this, and data you've got from in Shropshire says this. So that classic kind of framework of, you said we did, that lots of people joke about, saying, you said we didn't. We changed that slightly to say, you said, they said, we did. So you said, what did the workforce say? First and foremost, 2 years we've been asking you, and what have you said? Because we're going to respond, we're going to listen to that. And then they said, elsewhere, the ostensible experts, the other services, HMI, NFCC, they're saying this. And so what can then the senior management team and people like Dan conclude to do? And that's where the recommendations come out the bottom, really. And that's why it's been so good. It's been so good for me as a researcher to come in with an existing body of data and an engagement survey that was hot off the press. It wasn't like I was going back saying, what did we last ask in the survey in 2005 or 2010? It was very, very current. It was still really taking place. It's made a huge difference on what we found, really. And to then straight into what Dan just mentioned about the large fire engines, I call them, but I think Dan's more precise by calling them XL cabs, because they're not really larger than your usual big Scania 6-seater fire engine. They've just got more seats in. And the workforce was clear. They really like large fire engines. They really value them. They value them for lots of reasons. But I already read from lots of different research, both in this country and overseas, about fire engine size, about, what happens when you use smaller fire engines, what happens when you use bigger ones, what's operationally effective, what's cost efficient. And it's pretty clear that, large fire engines do represent good value for money from an operational perspective, kind of 2 crews being able to turn up to one house fire, and you've already got good numbers there at an RTC. We all recognise this value there. Yeah. But what we'd never really looked at was the cultural impact of large fire engines, really. And that's what I tried to do with this research, knowing that the workforce valued them, that it seemed to be good practice. They seemed to be doing something positive for Shropshire and perhaps even its culture. And so I went really into the literature and found some stuff on fire engines and on, lots of different things. And I suppose the best way to summarize it was that we started with an innovation which was borrowed from a volunteer model, which was research done by Bussell and Forbes in 2005, which was effectively called the 4 W's of volunteering. And they're what, the where, the who, and the why. So we looked at those. Who are we trying to recruit? On-call firefighters. Where are they? They're within 5 to 10 minutes of the local station. All that. Got as much information as we could about them. And the important one was the why. So why do they decide to become on-call firefighters? And when we looked at all the evidence we had on that, and we came up with, I think we've talked about this before, Pete, the 5 primary reasons why the research suggests people would join the on-call fire service. You look at commitment to community, belonging, excitement and status, making a difference and camaraderie. They are all facilitated by a larger fire engine. That camaraderie happens on the pump, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That sense of belonging happens when, 7, 8, 9 of you jump on that pump and go together to an incident. The excitement and status, you're on a bigger red fire engine, the greatest symbol of the fire service, arguably, and the reason why people often, especially young people, often love the fire service is because of our big red shiny trucks.
Isn't that potentially, though, I mean, Dan, perhaps this is more of a question for yourself, isn't it potentially a difficult one for people to try and replicate in terms of cost, getting that many people onto crews and stuff like that? And some people may argue, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, the sustainability of sending a higher number of crew to an incident than is minimal crewing requirement, for example.
Yeah, we've been challenged to that as well. We have, you could almost say sending 9 is that efficient and as effective as sending 4. And that was one of the challenges that I wanted to get to the bottom of with the research. And I think it's really important for me to kind of frame what this is all about. The research for me was so that we could carry on doing the right thing for the communities of Shropshire. And I know that might sound twee, but it really is about making sure, as we kind of identify as an on-call fire and rescue service. So as we've got a fantastic 128 full-time firefighters, 5 full-time appliances, but the majority of our staff are on call. So we've got to have a focus on them. And it was anecdotally that if more firefighters went out to calls, to incidents, that they were staying. And I think it was kind of anecdotally reflected in what Steve said about our tenure, operating at 13 years on average, keeping a firefighter, an on-call firefighter, which is fantastic when you compare it to the national average.
I was going to say, when you think about that cost aspect as well, you've got the retraining thing, but is there also maybe to build that bridge into the economical work that you do? If you're sending more than 6 or 7 people on an on-call crew, that negates the requirement for a makeup as well. You haven't got to get
Absolutely.
a second or third pump there, and the costs imposed in that. And people go, oh, it's just another fire engine, same amount of people. No, it's not, because then you've got the logistical move of other stations covering certain areas, your inability to respond to those areas. And
20, 30 minutes away.
Exactly. This is what I'm saying. So was there also
the road risk? Yeah, so when you look at it, and what Steve has done in providing the sustaining success, and it's not the easiest thing to say. We didn't think about that. We'd be on a podcast trying to say sustaining success repeatedly. But what it identifies is actually, it's a legitimate, and what it does is, for the sake of 2 or 3 hours on a crew, you get so many benefits. But when someone comes at the service and says, well, it's inefficient, you go, actually, it's not. It's adding social and economic value. Is it because
people get confused with things like lead measures and lag measures and stuff like that, and they don't see the wider ripples?
And I think for me, it's the cost versus value piece. So the Home Office at the moment is carrying out similar research to the NFCC. So the NFCC have produced the economic and social value of fire, and the Home Office is going to produce the cost of fire. And I think that's where the differential
You're not for 1 minute
in.
suggesting that we're duplicating work in the emergency services, are you, Dan?
No, it's very different in the fact that it's the cost. So the Home Office are looking at the cost of response, whereas I looked at the value. And I think this reflects on the extra large cabs. I get so much more value from the extra large cabs than it ever costs me in pounds, shillings and pence. And I think that's the difference. Whereas before it was a gut feeling, and the lived experience is that we had really high levels. What Steve's been able to do is take it from a kind of gut feeling and a narrative and an anecdote.
And yeah, I totally agree, Dan, really. And I suppose the large fire engines, you can see them as a cultural investment, the big topic in the fire service at the moment, culture. When we look at certainly the on-call culture, and we look at the importance of it and that it being fairly unique, really, that these large fire engines, they represent a cultural investment. It's a nominal extra cost of those few extra firefighters attending an incident, yet culturally it's massive. And so from Shropshire's perspective, where the data showed clearly that there needs to be a focus on retaining what's already a good level of firefighters with a high saturation of skills across the service, which helps them to keep pumps available because they've got a lot of drivers, and relative to the rest of the sector, a lot of ICs, although that's still one of the threats on the horizon for Shropshire, like many others, for various reasons that I think we touched on in the last podcast a little bit, but we can go into again, Pete. They engender retention, and in part that's simply because they reduce despondency. And when somebody's morale gets lowered because they live a bit further away from the fire station than their colleagues, or they're the person that in the middle of the night, and we'll all understand this, and probably some of your listeners will, if they're on-call firefighters, there's kind of nothing worse than your alert going off at 2:00 in the morning, driving to the fire station, and then you being the person that is number 7. The person that doesn't.
Well, not even that, mate. I mean, as I listen to you both here, one of my big, both concerns, but also considerations is whether or not people will be able to use this piece of data as a genuine, proven metric for the argument against some of these tactical response vehicles that we see emerging in a lot of services over the UK. And it's not that those things aren't well built or efficient and blah, 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 blah.
No, well, yeah.
It's they only hold 2 people, 2 firefighters, and the demonstrative effect I personally have found working on a station that has a tactical response vehicle that has on morale and teamwork, and also just the disengagement from people. It's not if you're the 7th person, it's if you're the bloody 3rd, you don't get to go sometimes.
Oh yeah, you're right. And in the research we covered that really, and I pivoted on research from Europe that talked about when tactical response vehicles are used, when smaller vehicles are used, what a few workforce surveys, some research from Tamar Vogel touched on it, and where the workforce was asked what they thought of smaller fire engines. And then there's quite a bit of research, really, less research about the benefits of larger fire engines and more seats, but plenty of research about the negative side of going smaller, really. And that's why I pivoted on that really in the research. And then you're right, they sort of, that despondency can go across the board really. If you're not self-fulfilling as an on-call firefighter, if you're not that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you become an on-call firefighter because you're fulfilling that top part of the triangle, that self-actualization. You're doing it to make that extra difference in your life and other people's lives. It's not to meet the basic needs of and economic necessities of your life.
But I mean, connecting those dots, will that be enough, Dan, to be able to, sort of stem that tide of tactical response vehicles? Because we can say about culture, and we can say about, hierarchies and fulfilling our fulfillment and all that jazz. But when those decisions, and perhaps I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of Shropshire, Dan, but from speaking to other fire and rescue services and the people that are counting the beans, will those arguments be enough? People go, look, it means a lot of engagement. It stops people leaving this, and this, and here's the numbers. Are those dots strongly enough connected that, will justify people stopping making those decisions?
I'm not sure, if I'm honest, Pete. I think with all of this in sharing it so early, because I have had some challenge about us sharing the learning so quickly. I think there was a very, very traditional response to me from colleagues that should we be sharing this so early? Shouldn't we have some evidence that it's worked? Now, for me, and I've spoken with NFCC colleagues and national colleagues, this is really a reflection of what works for Shropshire. It comes back to that point of that internal focus. And what I'm hoping with sharing the research is that we can pay it forward, that it might So you've mentioned those 37 existing good practices in Shropshire. Well, when we share this across the UK, and however that people engage with us over it, that could turn into 40 or 50, and it turns into almost a library of flexible approach. And Steve will talk about the FIRES approach, where flexibility is key. So I think for me, it's offering that narrative from a Shropshire perspective that the extra large cabs have been really great for us. And I think that will allow at least a platform for a different perspective. So I'm not sure it will necessarily be strong enough to connect the dots for some fire and rescue services, because they will have to base it on their risk. But I think it offers a different narrative to, what Sir Tom has said, previous chief HMI, about it's a doomed shift pattern. And I think what we're trying to do is give people hope, because at the root of all of this is fantastic people who want to and have a desire to perform a role which is bigger than them. That's why they join. They join to sit on a red fire engine, but they also join to help people. And I think what we're trying to offer is that hope that as long as you can tap into that and maintain the people as a focus, there is a real opportunity for success and building this high availability.
I'm a sucker for a mnemonic, Steve. So you've got to take us down into that FIRES mnemonic, if you could.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. I just wanted to say before we leave fire engines, there's research by Ward and Winstanley in 2005 looked at symbolism in the fire and rescue service.
Well, it's massive, mate. That's why we brought the badges back, and it was horrible to see some of the badges go.
Yeah, it's massive. So the fire engines are symbolic of the fire and rescue service. They're symbolic of Shropshire's success, and what they really do is they reflect a spend to save approach. They reflect a service that continues to invest in its on-call workforce or in the stations that those larger fire engines function out of. And that message is really powerful. And when you have smaller fire engines, even if they make sense in certain areas, which they also do, admittedly, if you're an on-call station and you want to get as many people as you can to ride that truck to get to do the job they've signed up to do, then they really value the fact that the service is valuing them by furnishing them with larger fire engines. So as a cultural investment, they're just a really smart strategy.
Do we know, sorry, before we go into the fire, Steve, Dan, do we know the rough cost difference between, and this probably is not a helpful question, it's just a curiosity for me, between a standard tactical response vehicle, and I know that's a very difficult question, and you will no doubt have some pushback from whatever answer you do offer, if you're happy to offer one, because is it a colossal jump? Is it 100 grand? Is it? I don't know.
No, so it depends on what's being offered as the kind of alternative. But for us, obviously, the whole kind of chain, the whole supply chain piece and inflation has meant that fire engines are costing us more, else if you can even get hold of a chassis.
Yeah.
But, they weren't costing us significantly more. It was working with our kind of coach builder to just shape it differently. And I think that's really key. And I think the other thing to remember is that sometimes they go out with 4 anyway. Yeah. Sometimes we've got four on-call firefighters, so it goes out with 4. And I think that's really important to remember. So it'll always go out with a minimum, but there is that chance that if you're available and you've spent all day staying in, compromising family arrangements, not going shopping, not going to
it's hard to keep justifying it to the missus, mate, I'll tell you.
Yeah, and that's it. But if there's 9 seats on it, you've got a better chance. And I think that's Steve's absolutely right in the symbolism of this. And it comes back to something that I'm really keen is that we bring the joy back to being an on-call firefighter.
100%.
And I think that's absolutely key to retain people. And our strategy following the research is about keeping people. If we can keep more people than we lose, then we've got a chance at good availability. And what we'd reduce is the burden on those remaining few that are fighting tooth and nail to keep that fire station open.
You don't want to start begrudging it, do you? That's when the downward spiral. I absolutely loved it. I did 10 years, with the RDS and the on-call. And I'm probably terrible at giving examples, but I used to think of it like Cub Scouts on steroids, because I was like, you've got bigger, cooler toys and you do a job that tangibly makes a colossal difference in the community. And it's just such a scream. I'm sure a lot of people won't like the name frame that I give to it, but it's so much fun. Do you know what I mean? It's just an incredible club to go to, where you really get an opportunity to flex your innovative physical skill sets by coming up with real genuine, rescuing and community safety sort of ideas and innovations.
Yeah, and you've spoken in previous podcasts about culture and toxic cultures on stations and on watches. I think this provides a different narrative of the positive culture that's created, particularly when you think the majority, predominantly, our on-call stations cover the landmass and are the majority of stations that exist within England, I think, and Steve will give us the numbers, but I think it's really important to remember that if you get the right culture at a station, they are fantastic. They will provide 100% availability.
Everything. Yeah.
They will have fun. They will also be really good at helping people on the worst day of their lives. And that's ultimately what people want to do. They want to help others. They want to perform a role that's bigger than them. And it is about status. But we need to focus again on the enjoyment aspect of it. And that's not to take away from the seriousness of our role and what we do before, people fire into me and say, well, what about this? What about that? But for us, we're kind of starting on this journey, a 2-year project. And for me, one of the ambitions is to thin the stuff that's not necessarily. We need to do the critical stuff that keeps our firefighters safe. That's my red line, firefighter safety. But if people are enjoying coming to work, and like you said, that club, we have had that conversation. It's a really hard one to pitch, because straight away it kind of elicits that conversation around culture and the boys club and things like that. And I think that is a fair challenge. But when done right, and on-call fire stations up and down the country, and whole-time on-call stations, when you have the right culture, the right leadership and the right people, fantastic things can be achieved.
100% agree. So take us into that culture, Steve. I'm sorry I've interrupted you a couple of times.
No, it's great. It's great. I'm loving this. It's as we skip forward to the acronym FIRES, as we talked about in a previous podcast, Pete, this research kind of started with the conception of how to develop a research-led model of good practice for fire engines, and did that work at Keele University with Staffordshire. And one of the things that was quite clear initially was that there was this set of sort of ideas and values which stood out in all the research that I was reading, all the literature that I was reading, that every time a workforce, wherever they were in the world, were asked about what was conducive to their retention within the fire service, what made for a good cultural workplace, and what they needed to hang around really and continue to be a volunteer firefighter or an on-call firefighter, was these certain characteristics, and they were flexibility, inclusivity, recognition, empathy, and support. And
that flexibility is a big aspect of what Core and whatnot were able to. I know there's lots of other systems out there, but that was the big thing I saw there.
It was, and that was so when then we carried the work on and extended it in Shropshire. It was really clear that to begin with, the workforce data, the number one thing that everybody was talking about in stations, focus groups, was the need for flexibility. It was like flexibility was the thing that was going to keep them in role now, and that was really, really key. So, as you've just touched on, also clearly the software that Shropshire use for its availability is one which just it starts with its strapline of flexibility. Its whole reason to be is to allow on-call firefighters to be available when needed but free when possible. And that is the magic sauce, really, Pete. That's what we're really trying to achieve by crunching all these numbers, looking at all this data, looking at all that, is how to actually be clever to allow on-call firefighters to maximize their time off, whilst also making sure that they're there when they're needed. And when they're needed can be, just so there's sufficient crew 24/7, but it can also be even more sophisticated in the future by mapping availability and who's available to things like demand and the peaks and troughs of demand. And those, to segue Dan back in, really, one of Dan's biggest incidents when he first came to Shropshire was a big, long, protracted incident that was really challenging, which drew on the on-call resources and the resources of the service as it protracted. And that's where demand...
You've not been creating car parks, have you, Dan?
Do you know what? It was a 30-day waste fire that when Steve mentioned it, there was a little bit of a shiver going down my spine.
Yeah, I used to love putting messages about like that. I'd always say this is a rubbish fire, just to try and make the people in the control room smile. I always used to get told off the things I used to say on the main scheme radio. I've learned a little bit, but you know.
Yeah, me too, Pete.
Take us into...
But I think, sorry, Pete, it is a hard one to kind of share that one, the fires thing, and I absolutely can't believe we've created an acronym that actually spells out fire. So kudos to Steve for actually creating that in its first in the first instance, because it's bound to catch on, isn't it? But
yeah.
The flexibility piece is a hard one to pitch because, Steve mentioned the on-call sustainability review that we did with Steve Perks, who went out and spoke to everyone. In essence, what he was getting back was we want to be available less. And through the research and through kind of benchmarking the kind of nation of the fire and rescue services, one of the recommendations that comes from it is a change in contracts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we followed other fire and rescue services in offering heavily reduced hours of cover. And I think that's one that we kind of have to keep kind of sharing with staff within Shropshire, is that we do talk about flexibility, but actually there is a high level of availability. So we're not going to necessarily introduce 40-hour availability contracts, 30 hours, 60 hours. Because our success has been based on the 84-120. What we want to do is provide more flexibility around the hours that people can provide. And that's a difficult conversation to have with staff who, in essence, were expecting to kind of get a 40-hour contract. But the challenge is for those services who have invested either in different contracts or invested with additional funding for those reduced contracts, is that, in essence, you essentially double your workforce, double your kind of pay budget, and halve your availability. So without this research, I fear that we may have followed the same path. But because of it, now we have a level of confidence that actually we need to maintain availability contracts over 80 hours, but you allow our local leaders, those watch managers who are on station all the time, always available, support them to lead the team. And I think that's where the flexibility comes in. And
you can't start micromanaging people to those.
Not a chance, because we're not there.
That decision-making aspect, just you can weaken that muscle to such an extent they then start to lose the confidence to make decisions around general culture as well. And that's a really fast spiral then if you diminish their ability to do that.
We want to provide the support for those watch managers, those local leaders who are leading the station. They know when to lean in and have a little word. They also know when
people. It's not like whole time where managers will chop and change and trade and move stations and stuff like this. The on-call stations are built around those passionate people
who live within 5 minutes of the station. Yeah. that's the long and short of it, isn't it?
Yeah. And can I just add to, I know I didn't really qualify well, but the FIRES, as well as it being a convenient acronym, it's
an excellent acronym
for the listeners. It is based on a huge amount of literature that's coming from different surveys over time, over the last 20 years within the sector. And I could, reel off a load of references really. But it's these facets of a particular culture at the on-call's core just scream out as being really key for the workforce. And so, and I can't qualify them really. Yeah, go on.
That's the bit I love about it. That's the bit I absolutely love, is that it's so simple, but when you scratch at the surface, it becomes the most complex, well-researched evidence thing in your life. But in order for every single firefighter to be able to access it, that's why it is so effective, because it's so simple. That doesn't mean that there isn't loads and loads of research and brain power that's gone into it, but that's what makes it so good.
And as we've talked about a lot, it's really important to be able to operate. You know, we need core values, we need codes of ethics and all that, but also there needs to be culture operationalized, and with an on-call workforce, when cultures happen, to quote Sir Tom, when no one's looking, you've ultimately got to have something pithy, something that firefighters can call upon to think, oh yeah, you know, the fire's culture is important to me, and it is important to this station and this service. But ultimately that flexibility, as you touched on then, Dan, that kind of like, you know, quantity has its own quality. That was what the Dutch did as well. So the Dutch kind of went, well, if we just get lots more firefighters, that will immediately let everybody do less hours and we can have more flexibility. Now, that's contingent upon massive spending in training departments, massive spending on infrastructure, on resources. So it's not really a viable approach for most services, really. But the FIRES acronym, if I may, I wanted to give a couple of examples really of how it works. Yeah, because, you know, flexibility, it's what I was saying, oh, you're trying to be flexible. It sounds really nice, but what does it mean in the on-call context? Well, the workforce kind of, these are almost words of the workforce, really. It means that we cover each other when we can. And we recognize that flexibility is for all, it's mutually beneficial, and it's reciprocal, and it's fair. So ultimately, it's an example is, if you need to book off as an on-call firefighter at the weekend, even though you're due on according to, you know, your contract or what your commitment you've given, but you can communicate with the rest of the crew and say, please, everybody, bit of flexibility. Can somebody cover me? 9 times out of 10 in a station with a good culture, somebody will just jump on and book on for you and use an app-based system like FSR that facilitates that really easily. And then you'll get the cover that's needed when it's needed. And that's a really key example of how you can then get people in the right place at the right time covering each other. The inclusivity is kind of off the back of also Shropshire's cultural impeller, really, which is the importance of inclusivity, recognizing that all are included. And there's a lot said about equality, diversity and inclusion, and a lot of important work happening in the fire service to try and improve it. But ultimately, it can also be encapsulated within inclusivity. If everybody is included and all are considered and all in, then difference, especially of opinion, is considered as positive. It just comes out of all the literature. That's really valued by those in the fire service and the on-call service, really. And that the recognition part really comes from, it's another way of saying that is that beyond salary. We always talk about paying contracts, and at the moment this looming large in the fire service narrative because of our pay offer award that's hanging as the pregnant pause as we conduct this podcast, Pete.
Pregnant pause, I love it.
But beyond that, there's research suggests firefighters, like everybody else in life, really want recognition. And so it goes back a bit to the large fire engines, that they're, you know, implicitly recognizing the value of the workforce by spending on something which is symbolic of that. And giving credit when credit's due. And I'll give you a really good example of what happens around the on-call services, which makes Dan and I have talked a lot about this, because I don't know whether all, maybe that's doing a disservice. I was going to say, I don't know whether all chiefs and assistant chiefs and so on understand the power they have to come to an on-call station just to join in, just to have a cup of tea, chat, and get on with the crews. That's massive in terms of the recognition at an on-call station when an executive leader just drops in.
It's tough to do that because it's one of those, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Some people, but I think the value in going far outweighs the damage in not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
But I think for me, it's what's really powerful is when you rock up with no agenda.
Yeah.
Yes.
When you just literally drop in and go, all right, everyone, no agenda tonight. Just wanted to come and see you and have a chat. And I think that's when it's really organic, really natural, not forced. Because, you know, I've got myself, Simon as the chief, and Guy Williams, who's the other assistant chief. We've got all of this information that we want to get across. But it's all about the listener. And I think that's where the dyslexia for me comes in, is understanding that people receive this information in a different way. So go and have the power of a brew is unbelievable, and it kind of ties in, Pete, as well to kind of some of the work you've done previously on the podcast with helping hoodies.
Yes, Had a conversation with him today because he actually recovered from lung cancer as well. A fascinating journey that handsome man has had, Phil Maynard. But sorry, go on.
Oh, but yeah, Phil and Phil and Helping Hoodies we were one of the first services to take it on, because it goes back to that piece about recognition. Stick a badge on it. People love and are proud to wear the badge. So let's not shy away from it. Let's not go, well, that's not the kind of approach we want. Actually, it is, because it keeps people, because they belong to something bigger than themselves. And Helping Hoodies for me was fantastic. It was, and we're one of the first, one of the first services, one of the first things I did when I joined Shropshire was making sure we got on board with that, because it really appealed. It helped firefighters.
It's a
charity.
bloody great thing to do, mate. Honestly, it was such a great
and it was part
thing.
of the momentum. Let's get on and do it, and to see the uptake of. And I'm actually wearing mine now, and often do, because it's got a badge on it and it says fire and rescue. And
do you know they started out with 2 or 3 services, and he did mention Shropshire. We literally recorded another episode with him today, and now he has 47 fire and rescue services on it. And I'm going to get it wrong, but there are like so many hoodies away from, I don't know, I think it's like 500, I don't know, thousands, but like they say, it's grown to 47 organizations now, and it's such a success story. I love it. What they've done there is amazing.
But I think that's what me and Steve have tried to do with this is that kind of pay it forward piece of those early adopters. If you want a management, but kind of piling in with it is like, well, it might work and it might not. Let's find out. And actually, our on-call firefighters, our whole-time staff, even our officers, myself and the chief have got plenty of them. It's got a badge on it. Let's be proud to wear the fire service badge and demonstrate the values that we know that aren't necessarily being reported at the moment, but we love to help people, so we're proud of what we do.
I wanted to ask you briefly, Dan, or maybe even Steve, because you both have different perspectives on this one, is the aspect we saw in the Innovation of the Year outcomes and the research showed around onboarding people quickly and our ability to do it and reducing the barriers to entry. I mean, for yourself, Dan, do you know how quickly from joining fire and rescue services now, I imagine you can only really comment from Shropshire's perspective, how quickly people can be getting on the run?
So, I can comment on other fire and rescue services. I just don't think they'd welcome it. But as I'm in Shropshire, I'll give it a go. It's for me, we're sharing some kind of a personal reflection now. So I come from a training background. I have done safe to ride for on-call firefighters, so within 2 weekends and a week they are safe to be on the fire engine and they're on the run, through to what we do in Shropshire where they are BA competent before they go.
Are they really? I think you're missing a trick there. You need to get it sooner than that.
Yeah, so it is very. So as part of the on-call sustainability project, what I'm asking the team to do is really look about how we train staff. And I think what it'll come back to, Pete, is it needs to be flexible, because you might have an individual who can have 5 weeks. They're self-employed. They'll go, actually, I'm going to crack this off in 5 weeks. But you might have an individual that you lose. But for the personal reflection is actually the conversion rate for us at the moment is something that we've really got to focus on. So people are starting with us, and I'm always surprised and kind of overwhelmed about how many people still want to take on the responsibility of being an on-call firefighter and kind of really warmed by it. But we're seeing people kind of start to kind of engage with it, get used to it, and we're seeing maybe 2 or 3 drop out from a course. So it's something we're reflecting on.
We've almost got like that activation window, haven't you, of between like excitement, and then that diminishes if it almost becomes a failure to launch if you can't initiate that within a certain countdown.
But also, if you don't give people enough time to assimilate and incubate the information. So, for example, it's Thursday night drill night and you've had them down and interview them and say, actually, you know what, next week you're on a course. And then we're seeing some of those individuals drop out because they haven't had time to understand and immerse themselves. So I think there's a balance to be had where you might invite an individual down for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then you get to know the person as well. And I think that's really important. It shouldn't just be a numbers game.
Yes, it is, because it's easier sometimes to get them in than it is to. I always say I'd rather have a hole than an arsehole, because it's tough once you get a bad egg into the culture. It's very hard to get them out.
And when it's such, and then it goes back to the fires culture, if you've got someone who's not contributing to a flexible, inclusive an empathetic culture and is not being supportive, then they're actually being disruptive. And when you're such a close-knit team,
a lot of damage.
Yeah, a lot of damage, and we've seen that. And it's a difficult job. It's a difficult job to deal with that, because I think the fire service traditionally probably gives people too much leniency, because we always want to see the best in people
really wrong
and help
to get
them.
Sacked. You really have got to fluff it up and commit sometimes illegal acts to get sacked. And I'm one. I've given out a fair few disciplinaries in my time, because I could say some very passionate things there, but like, it really boils me and boils my blood when I see people not enacting the cultures and the values, and just, it was here long before you, it will be here long after you. Do you know what I mean? You're just a custodian. This is not your thing. Treat it with respect. You are an ambassador for something globally that stands as a moral compass in the community.
Yeah, or some of our fantastic support staff who are really proud to work for the fire service. And
of course,
I often talk about the All Blacks. I'm a massive rugby fan. Played rugby until
no dickheads.
No dickheads. The All Blacks, no dickheads. And the other piece of that is leave the shirt in a better place than when you picked it up.
100%. And
I think I bring a lot of sports psychology into my leadership, and some other bits and bobs. But the fantastic piece of one that me and Steve have shared is "Turn the Ship Around" by David Marquet.
Yes, David Marquet. Have you also done "Winners" by Alistair Campbell?
Yeah, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Even if you don't like his political leans and whatever, it's a great piece of work.
But you might know him. So you might know him. Rich Hall, he was the previous assistant chief in Lincolnshire. Yes. And he introduced me to Turn the Ship Around, that leader kind of approach to management.
It's great. I love
it. And it changed my approach to leadership. It really did. And it kind of bringing it back into the on-call stuff. Steve, through his research, has also changed some perceptions that I've kind of had or learned over the years.
Careful massaging his ego, though. Careful. Steady.
Yeah, well, we had an on-call conference, and the hashtag was Steve-tastic, which really upset me, given that I'd facilitated it. So,
sorry, broke the number one power law there, didn't I, Dan? Don't shine your leader.
Yeah, Steve-tastic. Yeah. Never again.
So, now that we've sort of spoken around that onboarding window, is it still? So you say you're working to obviously develop that and try and reduce that timeline. I imagine some of that you've got to accept is outside of your sphere of control. But Steve, take us back into some of the other aspects that came out the other end of this sort of piece of research. And I know it's still in very much its infancy, but as we see it start to grow arms and legs, what are some of the things that you think other services could be? And again, we're not talking from an upon high mountain of perfection, but just some considerations that people could start taking away and discussing within their teams, perhaps.
Yeah, I get it. Well, I suppose one of the big things that stood out from all the research and is the E&S on the end of fires, really, the empathy and support, was that fundamentally any on-call firefighter, volunteer firefighter, it's their family and their primary employer and often other commitments that come first for all of them.
And so it should sometimes, because you can't pour from an empty cup. Do you know what I mean? If the family and the fortress isn't doing very well, everything else is going to fall apart pretty quick.
Yeah, a great metaphor. That's what we've got to try and we acknowledge even more in the way we have systems of work and the way that we crew, really, and always be empathetic and understand that where all our life circumstances are changing, especially in a service where you've got people that are staying on average for over 13 years, that 13-year cycle means that same person might go through, on average, they're going to go through 2 jobs in that time. Every 7 years, somebody changes a job. They're going to maybe have a kid that was a newborn, and then 13 years later, they're a teenager. That means they're going to be able to give very different levels of commitment and more or less support to their colleagues. And we often forget that. And we just think, it's about me and I've got to do my hours, got to get my quota. And actually, with a lot more empathy and a lot more support and the really good stations and all the research suggests that's really key to keeping it successful and keeping it sustainable. But in terms of one of the big take-homes, Pete, that comes from all the literature and came out of the engagement survey in Shropshire, which is one we haven't really talked about as much, was for recruitment, the prioritization of very local recruitment. Okay. So in Shropshire, 70% of the workforce, when asked, when they said 70% of 258 firefighters when asked how did they join the fire service, they said through local word of mouth. I knew a family or a friend who was an existing member. That's 70% of that. Now, then when you look at the other research that's been done, there's a lot of research that reflects almost that exact figure. So where one study by the Chief Fire Officers Association in 2016, another one that was of station managers in 2015, all of them were just repeatedly saying it's local word of mouth, local word of mouth. And yet we seem to have in recent times been really fixed on increasing social media presence, increasing national awareness, and whilst that's good for awareness, it doesn't necessarily behoove local recruitment, which needs to take place within 5 minutes of an on-call fire station. So
what are the tactics that you can actually enact a strategy like that, though?
Okay.
What does that look like? Is it open evenings at a fire station?
Well, good question. All of the above. It's going to be all the things that we have done traditionally in many, many services and many, many stations. But some of the things we haven't done before, really, and I know some services have, but certainly Shropshire's seeking to do it now. And it was one of the things that Dan really been pushing for was this local leaflet. Now, it's not just a local leaflet that is just generically tailored to Shropshire Fire and Rescue Service, but it's for the specific station. So that station, and you look at its incident numbers, the amount of money that a firefighter can expect to, earn at that station, and a variety of other little data points and pieces of information that are really useful to somebody who may be considering joining the fire service. So that we've talked about this before, Pete, so that we are setting realistic expectations, so that we're not getting people into the service and then we're just their attrition rate's really high and they're dropping out after a very short period of time because they've ended up doing something they weren't fully aware of. So those local leaflets, and then enacting them locally, and then actually making sure we're out there on the streets handing leaflets out and being a presence in the community. Because we also talked about this a lot, and I think we've talked about it, Pete, is in the absence of high incident levels and activity levels that year on year have been dropping, thankfully, because of our success in our prevention and protection work, we found that we're in the community less and less, and being in the community on that big red truck was always the best advert we could ever have.
Got to be out there. Yeah,
got to be out there. So one of the things that's happening in Shropshire now, and I think we share that, Dan, is that we've done this. One of the innovations from the research was this work looking at the widest possible pool of recruits, because locally, as part of understanding the target group and who you've got available, we need to know how many recruits potentially are in that local area surrounding that fire station. And so Adrian Thomas said that in 2015. He said each station should understand its widest possible pool of recruits, because then we understand the vulnerabilities of a station, the strengths of a station, how much training it's going to need, how much support it's going to need in the future. But up until we did this research, nobody had worked out really how to do it. So we put our minds to it, and we've come up with a clever methodology using some technology and some data points from the Office for National Statistics to actually get a fairly good estimate of the number of prospective on-call firefighters around an on-call station. And then that means who you're targeting, how many you're targeting, to some extent how many people you're reaching with your social media campaigns. If you're actually getting enough hits on your website and that you're taking in all those potential candidates in terms of figures. And then what you can do really importantly is you can calculate their diversity. You can plug the gaps in the data on local diversity by saying, let's say station A, we've worked out there's 100 possible recruits in that given area. And then you can layer in some data from the World Health Organization and the Office for National Statistics and identify actually realistic aspirations for diversifying that workforce. And then you can get another layer of sophistication on it by looking at how long people stay at that station, what your turnover is like, and you can actually calculate the length of time it will take for each individual station to diversify according to either addition or attrition. So according to whether you just add somebody to the current establishment of firefighters, or you wait for somebody to leave before you add somebody in order to increase your
That's
diversity.
when it becomes useful, isn't it? When you can start extrapolating those numbers. But another factor that I wanted to ask about, probably for yourself, Dan, is around once we've got people on board, and it's something Steve spoke about before around skill sets on stations. And I still am yet to come across a way for us to incentivize people to pick up those skill sets around incident command and driving and stuff. Because in the UK, we still don't recognize those skill sets very much. Obviously, you get an acting up allowance for things like incident command and your safe to command tickets, but in terms of driving, that's like a thing that I feel is creeping up on all emergency services. There seems to be less of an appetite for people to drive fire engines. It was always a dream for me as a kid, but a lot of people don't seem to be taking on those roles anymore.
No, you're absolutely right. And one of the other things that Steve brought to the piece was the crewing resilience formula, which I think he kind of touched on in the last podcast, which is that if you want to maintain reasonable kind of minimum availability, then you need a certain number of on-call firefighters. So the formula is 10 on-call firefighters with 4 drivers and 4 OICs. We recognise this is a if I just focus on the incident command aspect for a moment, the biggest barrier one of the biggest barriers to availability is where you don't have a driver or you don't have an incident commander. So you might have 5 or 6 people ready to go out, but you don't have someone who is able to do it. And I think for us, it certainly posed from a strategic and leadership perspective, because I think it's reflective of where the sector's been over the last 5, 10, 15 years, where there isn't necessarily a differential or difference between our on-call and our whole-time firefighters. One has 42 odd hours a week and one has 2 hours a week, yet they still seem, the expectation is they have to maintain or achieve the same level of input. And what we've identified is that we probably need to work harder or find a way of incentivizing people to be incident commanders. Not necessarily, we haven't gone to the driver piece, but if I stick on the incident commander piece, is that we absolutely support all of our staff to achieve their best outcomes, to be the best they can be. So traditionally that might be some management kind of qualifications, but actually there needs to be a recognition now that some people just want to turn up and ride the truck, and I think that's where we're at the moment. And one of the recommendations we're looking to implement is an introduction of a role that sits between firefighter and crew manager, and for want of a better word, a leading firefighter, someone who is that experienced individual. We've identified through the research that about 7 years nationally, there's that dip where people consider, well, what's next? I've done everything I can. I'm a competent BA wearer. What's next for me? And what we're hoping to do is kind of hook into that esteem, that knowledge, that understanding for them as a leading role, as a experienced person, that they get the recognition for that. And whether that's 1 bar on the helmet and 1 bar on the shoulder and an ARA for that, but it's not just when they do it. So at the moment we pay individuals when they respond to a shout, but actually what I'd like to do is incentivize them to be that leadership role as a leading firefighter, or insert any other name for it, that recognizes that they want to do that. And I think that's the first step for us, is that reintroduction of that leadership role that sits between firefighter and crew manager.
I think they're really important, because I think they almost act as like cultural architects as well, because they don't just become the experienced person or the old sweat on the watch or on the station or whatever. They really are one of the biggest fulcrums almost in the crew into how engaged people are. They are that calibrator of culture when behaviors or standards start to slip, because they're part of the crew. Right. You know what I mean? They're right there. They're not seen as the management. They're seen as the part of the team.
And if I reflect on my journey, Red Watch Kidderminster, leading firefighter Tony Wilkes and firefighter Trevor Merrick, Ernie, they were the ones that instilled the standards that I still carry today. And they, if I'd have landed on a different watch, I might have different standards or different expectations, but I landed on my feet and they kind of gave me that passion and belief in standards and high standards that I carry through to today and expect staff to maintain that. And that is exactly the role that we're looking to kind of incentivize and create. But it's not money. Yes, it will come hopefully with a recognition from a financial recognition, but it's about the recognition of them. It's about valuing them as an individual. And if that's
100%.
one black stripe on their helmet and a bar on their shoulder, I think that's a small price to pay for them to feel like they are recognized and valued by the organization. But that's just a recommendation. It's something that we're exploring. But I think it's got some real mileage, particularly within our on-call. I think the threat to that is if it undermines the crew manager role. But I think there's some work for us to do in recognising what's essential. It goes back to this point I made earlier about what is critical for our on-call to complete and what's nice to have. Yeah. And if someone wants to develop and expand their skills, then we'll support them. But the expectation is that they do the critical stuff in order to be safe on the fire ground and lead effectively when no one's looking.
So, Dan, I know it's something we've discussed with Steve around this widest possible pool, but from your perspective, because obviously we'll all have a unique lens that we look at that aspect for people that aren't familiar with that sort of terminology, can you give us an understanding of what that looks like when it comes to people trying to recruit and what layers we apply to it?
Yeah, and reflecting on where it came from. So Steve and I were sat in the kind of lecture room at Hodner. It sounds grander than it is. And we were talking about actually doing a case study. So within sustaining success, we did a case study of recruitment and ethnicity within the local station area that Steve works at and is familiar, lives within. And it was a fascinating kind of talking point about, well, why don't we go and talk to female candidates? Why don't we talk to people who live within the area from an ethnic background? So we did, and that was kind of the kind of initial thought process, and it goes back to the kind of sparking off and those conversations, which led to the research with the widest possible pool, which took it wider than Hodner and actually took it to all 22. In fact, it took it to all 23 of our stations, although Telford doesn't have any on call, but it's certainly something Steve did. So we spoke to everyone in Hodner from an ethnic background and asked them if they wanted to be a firefighter, and they said no. And I think that's really rich data, particularly when you look at kind of the HMI and inspections and some of the kind of national rhetoric around ethnicity and gender. I think certainly for us as a fire and rescue service, we didn't know it well enough in order to argue the case. It comes back to the whole.
I think we knew it, but we didn't have the data. There's the problem. Do you know what I mean? Because people go, look, these certain people don't want to be. And that's not to say that certain genders or certain religious backgrounds don't want to be. But we do need to have the data to say what does success look like? Because actually, if 1 out of 10 people in a recruitment campaign comes from this diverse background, maybe that is success. To say that we need to have 40% or 50-50, is that even realistic?
And I think that was the driver behind this for me, is that actually all of this was about, well, what does the data, why am I kind of using a gut feeling, or Dan Quinn says, or Simon Hardiman says, or Steve Sadler says? Let's find out. So what Steve was able to do is use lots of whiz bang and gizmos to find out, ONS data and isochromes around each station. So he created a 5-minute isochrome around each station. And I think that's important, without being too geeky, to understand where we can recruit. And I think the 5-minute turnout is something that where's it come from? What has been the driver for 5 minutes? And what we've been able to do is expand that from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes from around the stations. And at some stations, for us, it makes zero impact because there's no rich or high numbers of residents 5, 6, 7 minutes out. But for one of our stations, it doubles the potential recruits. So it gives us that data and evidence to go, actually, at this station, it's not going to be 5 minutes anymore. And that comes back to the fires culture, where you say, for that station, it's going to be 6, or for that station, it's going to be 7. And rather than it just being decision or a character or ego led decision. It's based on evidence, so it'll stand up to scrutiny. And what it also did was allow us to look at, okay, so what kind of residents do we have within that area? So at one of our stations, we have 23 suitable candidates on the desktop review. And when you apply Adrian Thomas's report, which says 50% of those people in the widest possible pool won't want to be firefighters, and I think that's really generous, you're down to 12 firefighters, 12 potential firefighters.
Yeah.
How on earth do we run a fire station like that? I think we've got the 12. They're already on-call firefighters. But
otherwise you build a stick and beat yourself with it indefinitely.
Absolutely. And I think what it's allowed us to do, and we're going to do a survey, we're going to go and knock on doors to actually find out if 50% is a realistic. I don't think it is. I think maybe 10 to 20% of people might have an interest, and I think we're going to grab those and carry them on our shoulders to the stations. But
they might all start listening to the podcast, Dan. You never know. You might
never know. Probably not after they've heard me. But in essence, what we wanted to do is really know our people and know our data. And what it allows us to do is have those difficult conversations around, okay, so we've got some of the best availability, and there's some great availability out there. The likes of Humberside is another example of good availability, and so the Welsh brigades also have good availability. So there are, and as I said before, we're not saying we've got it right. We're just sharing our learning, but it gives us the chance to be able to say, actually, do you know what? If you want availability, then actually that's the priority. If you want diversity, then we can achieve that. But based on our evidence, if we were to only replace those individuals who left because we have a really good tenure, then you're looking at an average of, I think it's about 85 years before our gender profile meets the local community. So it's very easy to say, why aren't you doing it? We absolutely have an ambition and a passion for our to diversify. It goes back to that neurodiversity piece. It's not just about, for me, it's not just about ethnicity or gender. It's also about diversity of thought, which I don't think is looming large in the conversation nationally or locally.
I think it's growing, this aspect of neurodiversity, and it's certainly a thing for me. Like, well, I say it ad nauseum sometimes. It's like, we want people, or we say these things, and it's like, I feel like sometimes we want people that look different but sound and think the same, and that's not a true reflection of diversity for me. And also, we'll just keep screaming at each other inside this echo chamber. We won't actually innovate and bring the sector forwards in the way that we like to think we would do in terms of the generic understanding of diversity, which actually doesn't include neurodiversity, which is essential.
Can I just say we should include socioeconomic diversity?
100%.
And the fire service can celebrate, probably like no other, that in the on-call sector, and the data shows that it's a massive success story in a world where, the common narrative is that the haves and have-nots, that we're being separated more than ever before politically, and the stratas of socioeconomic class are dividing us. In the on-call, you've got a massive melting pot of people from all sorts of backgrounds, and professional and skilled to unskilled, and it's something to celebrate in the on-call, the socio-economic.
That's what I love about the leveler as well. You have people that work in high-end firms working with farmers of different levels of economic ability, and also just people like me have got holes in every pair of clothes that I wear, but are just full of passion.
And I think, I recently had a colleague say to me that, you dance to the beat of a different drum. I'm not sure what that meant. I'm not sure whether it was a compliment or a criticism, but I think we have different tunes on stations, and we have different people who are bringing different perspectives. And, the very loose research, and you could have upwards of 20 to 30% of our stations with some type of neurodiversity. And you could go into the conversation about what's neurotypical, but I think we are a product of it, and our culture is, particularly at on-call stations, but I don't think we recognise and understand it. So I think it really benefit from similar research to this, really, in how do we know, why, who, what, and I think that's where this widest possible pool thing comes in. Because actually, if someone was to say to me, well, why haven't you improved your your numbers in terms of ethnicity or female on-call firefighters. Well, we're operating at 7%. Now, that might be successful. It might not. But I think at least now we have the evidence and we're in a position to have that conversation rather than...
Mate, I think in these next 5 years, we're actually going to really be able to celebrate the work that we've been doing for a long time. But just because we haven't really recruited a lot in the past 10 years, we're having so much retirement now. Yeah, we're going to have a landslide of all the success that we've tried. So we've been doing a lot of the right stuff for a long time. We just haven't seen the fruits of those labors just because we haven't been doing recruitment. And now that we are recruiting a lot more, I think we'll see the fruit of that labor pour through. And when you do then compare it with the greatest respect to other public sector organizations like the NHS, just one example, but they've been trying to get more males into, midwifery and nursing and all those sorts of things for like 30 years. And they've had little to no what would be perceived if we use the same metrics as success. Whereas comparatively, we've done very well.
Yeah, but I think for me, what we now, certainly within Shropshire, is understand it so much better. So we could, if we wanted to reflect our community, is add, as Steve has mentioned, we could add female firefighters in addition to those firefighters we already have. Yeah. But of course, that comes at a significant cost to the organisation. And whether we can afford it in the current climate. But it's a conversation we're having about driving that real desire, certainly within Shropshire, to have a more diverse workforce, because it only makes business sense. It makes sense to have different perspectives, whether that's gender, ethnicity, or the neurotype that you are. So we're passionate about it, but it has to be realistic about how it can be achieved. And I think that realism is what the widest possible pool gives me, is being able to have that conversation, because I can now say there's 4 stations where there is a high number of BAME candidates within the area. So there's absolutely no excuse why we're not engaging with faith groups, we're not engaging with rugby teams or going to the gym. Absolutely no excuse. But for those stations, for example, where we've actually spoken to those individuals and they have no interest, then let's stop putting the effort in there.
We might be overachieving. We don't know.
Yeah,
in a lot
some
of
stations.
Areas, before we, if we don't get the metric, then how are we going to be able to hold somebody accountable to something we don't have an understanding for yet?
And I think what this gives us is there's absolutely always areas for improvement. We'll continue to drive forward, but at least it's on a realistic playing field now, because we understand we've got 4 stations that are critically require firefighters. So that's where we'll focus our efforts, because availability and that statutory duty to provide a fire engine is absolutely critical for us to deliver. So it puts us in a really strong position to understand the conversation, which I don't think we were before the research. So I'm really grateful to Steve for pulling it all together. And I think, it comes back to that paying forward. I really hope that the sector kind of pick up on this research, because I think if we had a wider national understanding of every station's widest possible pool, I think it would put us in a great place to have a better conversation about it.
It would also stop us spending money arbitrarily down avenues where it's not really giving us an investment on return, just because it's the way it was always done, Dan.
I just want to pick up on your point, really, Pete, saying that potentially we've been overachieving. I would suggest that the stations are already calculated, and one of the parts of the value of doing it nationally for every single station would be, and that we would definitely identify that we have been massively overachieving at many stations for recruitment. That considering how limited that widest possible pool of recruits is at some rural stations, the fact that we've kept a legacy of 10, 11, 12 employees, there is no small business in the land that in a rural village that had a business where it needed to keep running, 12 people, and it only had a potential pool of recruits of 20 people, that it would be sustainable. And yet, because of the kudos of the fire rescue service, because of what we represent economically and socially, the communities in which we're embedded, we have to say, wow, we have done an amazing job keeping us where we're at now. And the other 2 things the widest possible pool work does is, as Dan said, brings The two big questions that have loomed large for the last 10, 20 years in the fire service, certainly for the on-call, have been this question of diversity and what does the data tell us about the opportunity to diversify amongst a community that can only recruit from its local population. And this turnout time conundrum that Dan touched on, really, that calculating the widest possible pool of recruits for each on-call station at 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minute, 8 minute turnouts allows you and executive leaders to really direct their strategy effectively and say, actually, just increasing that turnout time, that thing that's in our gift and has been much mooted in the last decade, at this one station will make a massive difference to its possibility to be sustainable. But at the next station, it won't. Like that is just, they're two really, really valuable contributions that this widest possible pool work can make, I sincerely believe.
There's two things that Steve's research has changed for me. And I think the first one is the way I look at our on-call. And I think that's really important. So I think previously I may have fallen into that trap that they are employees. Of course they're employees. Yeah. But I think what the research has done is actually made me think of them differently as paid volunteers. And since doing that, since kind of throwing myself into the research and, Steve, through his literature review and the work that we've done, identifying that the likes of Australia, America, Europe, they are carrying out the same role, but that by looking at it through a volunteer lens, and that staff should be cherished because actually they are really important and really hard to come across and kind of recruit and retain. That actually, if we looked at them as paid volunteers that are working for our organisation, I feel that certainly it's changed my perspective and the way that I lead and make decisions in regards to the on-call.
I think it's a necessary mindset shift because we can take things for granted. We can be very guilty of that, and it really has been run on passion and goodwill for so many generations now. That if I think we don't start to recognize
key. Yeah, I think the goodwill's absolutely key. But if you start treating them like an employee, like you will do that training and you must attend this time, rather than applying, as we said, that fires culture. But when you start thinking of them, actually, they're a volunteer, they're providing their time and effort. Okay, they're getting some small recompense and recognition, but I think that's made a real difference to me. And I think the kind of final one that's made a real difference is that service culture versus local culture. I think I've been guilty in the past of going out to stations and they've spoken passionately about the station and the community they serve, and kind of asking them to look at their shirt. What does it say on the shirt? And it says Shropshire, not necessarily the local station.
Yeah, I've seen some of that as well on-call stations where people try and then, you have different leaders come and try and give examples from other places in the service and try and impose this, we're all in it together. And it's not that people aren't saying we're all in it together, but you don't want to discourage that local pride.
And certainly some of the chief, Simon Hardiman, has said that actually there's a recognition that there's probably 23 chiefs in Shropshire where actually these individuals are leading those stations. And I think for me,
an on-call watch manager does far more, in my personal opinion, having done both roles the whole time and on-call. They do, the managing 20-something people on an on-call station is very different than a smaller. It doesn't easier, harder, or anything like that. But it requires a much wider bandwidth of leadership.
Yeah, constant as well, isn't it? So I think for me, what I've taken from it is actually, and the work that Steve's done in terms of cultures and micro cultures and, the kind of quote from Mark Hardingham at the Home Affairs Committee about multiple cultures existing within the fire and rescue service.
Yeah.
The research that Steve's done, or the research we've done in Shropshire with Steve, has actually kind of, I've taken a step back, and where I'm at now is I'm going to encourage that local culture, but I'll highlight the path to how it supports the wider service, rather than saying actually you're Shropshire first and you are Clun or Bishop's Castle second. Actually, it's completely changed the way I approach my leadership in they are serving their local community. Let's embrace that. Let's wrap our arms around that, because that means they will stay. and they will provide better cover.
That's where stationisms is good. That's why I like names on fire engines as well. And I don't know if your service does it or not, but let them put the name on the fire engine that's from that station. Let them have pride in it. Let them look after that asset. Yes, it belongs to the service, but let them have those stationisms a little bit. As long as they're not doing anything ridiculously dangerous and having their own operating procedures outside of service, rhetoric, then it's good.
And for me, it's about putting that badge on it. It's let them enjoy, let them be proud, and let them really embrace the communities that they serve. And then occasionally they'll go to a big job somewhere else in the county. But
that's where I like us to tap into. I call it tapping into the inner yank. Do you know what I mean? Let them be a little bit American about it. Let's high five. You haven't necessarily got to be as corny as me and start a freaking podcast about it. But there's nothing wrong with loving what you do and being proud of your station.
And I think that's for me. And that's what I want to encourage is actually is recognizing this pride though, and embracing it. Put on your helping hoodie. Be proud to wear the badge to the co-op. Because everyone knows you're a firefighter anyway. Isn't that part of the deal and part of the recognition? So let's embrace it.
You know what? Because when it comes to something going wrong, people will come to you then. They'll go, oh, God, I'm glad you're here. They'll come and knock on your door in the street because they know you're a firefighter. They know you're a source of good. They know you're going to be there to help. And we want kids and families in the community to be able to recognize these people because that's ultimately what's going to happen anyway.
And that's what the research tells us. Steve's research tells me that the more that people are celebrated, recognised and valued within their community, the better the on-call station is going to perform, better availability, and the more commitment we'll see.
And also the better relationship you have with their businesses. Me and Steve spoke before about recognising the businesses that allow their staff to do these sorts of roles. And that bit of recognition is not necessarily costly, but it's bloody important.
Mm-hmm. It is, and recognising everyone. And the little bit, a thank you and a brew goes a very long way.
Yes, 100%. Look, fellas, thank you very much for your time, and I sincerely look forward to speaking with you soon.
Bless you both.
Take care of yourselves, fellas. See you soon.
See you. Ta-da.
Bye-bye. Bye. Firefighters Podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continuing, please head over to our Patreon page where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.